all for coming, some from very far, because especially those from the other side of the ocean had some problems in getting here. We have beautiful spring weather today, not tomorrow anymore, but they didn't have that on the other side of the ocean. And so thank you very much for, especially for our American friends, for making the trip. We are all or have been, in one way or another, refugees, people forced to leave their homeland, obliged to look for a new one. This is the sad story of humankind. For the record, my own grandmother escaped from an eruption of the Etna in Sicily in 1912 and eventually arrived via Switzerland and Belgium after World War I. Many of my Greek friends are descendants of refugees from Asia Minor, and I'm sure that many of the present audience, simply judging from the names, could have his or her own story to tell. The current refugee crisis in Europe is only the latest episode in a continuous movement of forced migration. The United Nations Refugees Agency, for example, identifies at least 50 active camps on the Greek mainland that are housing undocumented migrants. Moreover, the UN has calculated that in 2013, more than 32,000 people a day were escaping from military conflict, and that nowadays more than 15 million people are fleeing their country, often for longer periods. Many, in fact, do never return. The Mediterranean has become a huge graveyard. And despite Europe's moaning, more than 85% of refugees find shelter in underdeveloped countries. And although it's difficult to be objective, the present-day refugee crisis may not really be worse than what has been happening throughout the centuries. Only it is at our doorstep and much more mediated by the international press. It brings out at the same time the worst and the best in us. Because we are all or have been refugees, we should, with Kant, Hegel and others, discard the absurd Justinian idea that through the common law of first possession, or usucapium, as Hobbes and Locke proposed, I was here first, we should think we have more claims on the land than those who arrived later. The impact, material or otherwise, of refugees is largely discussed in the first section of this workshop, and I'm glad that we found several scholars whose interest is in the present to help us better understand the past. And this is also the reason why we gladly accepted one of our works group researchers' proposal, Joan Garni, to link a small photographic exhibition of the Idomeni refugee camp in which she spent some time to this workshop. Archaeology, despite some progress in GIS, is not very suited to identify human suffering. This does not mean that we should sit on the sideline. Still, forced migration and diffusionism in general have long been tainted topics in archaeology, largely because of Nazi ideology, based on Gustav Cassina's idea and a too simple equation of pots meaning people, something of which also Gordon Childe was guilty in his early years. Both diffusionism and ethnicity were reintroduced in archaeological literature in the 90s, especially following considerable advances in archaeogenetics, with Colin Renfrew's Archaeology of Language of 1987 being instrumental. It was, however, David Anthony's paper, Migration in Archaeology, The Baby and the Bathwater, an American anthropologist of 1990, which rehabilitated migration in Anglo-Saxon archaeology, as shown by the later edited volumes, Migrations and Invasion and Archaeological Explanation of 1997, by Chapman and Hamerow, or the synthetic paper by Herke in Current Anthropology of 1998, as well as Sian Jones' book, or Stephen Burmeister's paper, Archaeology and Migration, Approaches to an Archaeological Proof of Migration in Current Anthropology of 2000. And also Susan Hakenbeck's paper in Archaeological Review of Cambridge of 2008. But if the phenomenon of large-scale migration is hence well studied by archaeologists, and recently still by the edited World Archaeology volume by Peter van Dommelen, much less attention has been given exploring unplanned, coerced, or involuntary movement of individuals and groups across social and environmental boundaries, as noted by Catherine Cameron. And this is what the present workshop intends to concentrate on. Apart from genetic, isotopic and osteological evidence that is instrumentally used to identify the presence of external population groups, we are left primarily with archaeological and textual sources, and this is what we will concentrate upon. But because of the present crisis, forced migration studies, and I'll show you some of these things, concentrating on refugees that have been forced to leave because of an existential threat, have increased considerably. And contemporary archaeologies of forced and undocumented migration, the title that Yanis and De Leon organized at the last November's American Anthropological Association in Minneapolis, are attracting more and more attention. And so a workshop, I think, is timely, and from the point of view of material studies, the present refugee crisis also allows an appreciation of the diversity of archaeological evidence accompanying these events. You can just mention children's cemeteries, makeshift camps, abandonment patterns along refugee routes, increased border security, hotspot camps, hotspot infrastructures, to refugee art, including what has been described as refugee porn, even, and Ai Weiwei's installation, or the Lanzarote underwater museum are good illustrations of this. Nothing can describe the human suffering, but with Hamilakis, we must ask how we can record, explore, and understand the materiality of the experience of forced and undocumented migration today, in its diverse forms. But perhaps a word on terminology first. Within this workshop, we concentrate on forced migration. Although Anne distinguishes between derivative forced migrations, responsive forced migrations, and purposive forced migrations, for our purposes, I think, it suffices to understand forced migration to have a political or a military basis, a flight from conflict or persecution, while voluntary migration is usually based on economic motives. But I think it would be unwise to categorize too heavily, even if for the purposes of this workshop, we prefer to retain the distinction. One could, of course, react and object that all migration is to some degree forced, and this is correct. But we specifically aim at understanding those that can be called refugees, people seeking safety elsewhere. And according to Article 1A of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, they are people who, and I quote, owing to well-founded fear of persecution on the grounds of race, religion, nationality, or membership of a social group, find themselves outside their country of origin and are unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country. Certain beds. Refugees are hence people who have been forced out of their homes, rather than migrants who are usually left with some decision-making in when, where, and how they move. Refugees are not specifically pulled towards something, but especially pushed out. They simply do not have a choice, even if they retain certain agency. Push factors may be abrupt and sometimes violent. Pull factors may be restricted or non-existent. Conflict-induced displacement can, of course, also take place within a country rather than across a border, but we aim to distinguish it from other types of displacement, such as development-induced or environmental displacement, like climate refugees. Although within the context of our specific workshop, the 13th century BC, especially the latter may have been, of course, instrumental, but we've discussed this in an earlier workshop. Exile, as a form of forced migration, apart from being a topos in ancient and modern literature, has of course also been a political tool often used in antiquity, best known from their applications by Assyrians and Chaldeans of Israelites in respectively 722 and 597 BC, or the ostracism tool used by democratic Athens, or the fate suffered by Ovid and Cicero. And Robert Garland's excellent book, Wandering Greeks, pays plenty attention to this aspect. But let me give two examples of how present-day refugees can perhaps help us to understand the past. In a study on newer refugees in Minnesota, John Holtzman starts off stressing that even in their place of origin, Sudan, material culture was not markedly rich. Apart from spears and some other weapons, a small number of cooking utensils and household implements, and very few personal ornaments such as beads or smoking pipes, there was no indigenous textile tradition and very few developed forms of visual art, such as mask making or other wood carving types. So it's no surprise then that when they were forced to leave, it was quasi impossible to carry personal belongings. And a few strings of black and white beads are the only items of newer material culture in a refugee home. They do continue, however, to prepare typical newer foods. Indeed, food, but also simply the smell of a flower, can revive the experience of the place that has been left behind. Likewise, Helen Taylor, in Refugees and the Meaning of Home, has discussed how the lived experience of home through sensory stimulation can help refugees. In exile, of course, material aspects of home are at the same time symbols of what has been lost and ingredients for reconstructing it. And Sandra Dudley, who we'll hear tonight, has given plenty of attention to these homemaking practices in refugee contexts. And religion too can be considered as a homemaking device, as Horstman has discussed. Colloque furthermore underlines that refugee cultural traits often have a limited visibility and a low message potential because of their general disposition not to shock local sensibilities. This is why maintenance activities, for example, such as cooking, weaving and caring, are often much more reliable parameters than high-class ceramics that have a great message potential, although some scholars are now starting to recognize art as a way to cope with exile, with productions either retaining the memory of the homeland or being a way to resist assimilation and incorporation. Hodder, of course, already insisted on the more pronounced signaling of ethnic identity in contexts characterized by severe stress and competition. My second example comes from an Oxford-based refugee research group directed by Alexander Betts, working in Uganda. They recently published a leaflet called Refugee Economies, Rethinking Popular Assumptions, in which they refuted that refugees were economically isolated, that they were a burden, that they were economically homogeneous, and technologically illiterate and dependent. Through their study of a series of makeshift refugee camps, they show vibrant economic systems that can thrive below the radar and develop from the ground up. The interesting part was that each of the studied refugee camps was composed of 6 to 10 different national, ethnic and religious groups. Although spatially clustering in specific areas of the camps, daily crossed into the other areas for trade and exchange. And within the respective areas, several vibrant markets had sprung up, which were frequented by people from the entire camp. Moreover, the camps, though spatially isolated, attracted goods and people from the outside. Refugees, moreover, were employed or being employed by locals, and internally showed a great diversity. Moreover, hardship had often forced them to innovate technologically, which is shown by the two images at the bottom. They furthermore showed great ingenuity finding alternative opportunities for self-reliance and remained part of extensive international trade networks, often more impressive than those of the people in whose land they had settled, in fact. Such examples are quite instructive when dealing with archaeological evidence, I think. But if we come back to this workshop, we are especially interested in how refugees use material culture. The reason why, of course, I asked Sandra Dudley to speak about this topic tonight because of her book of Materializing Exile. Sandra has lived in a Karenni refugee camp on the Thai-Burma border for extended time periods, and I think she's perfectly placed to discuss displacement by focusing on material culture and embodiment perspectives. But you may have noticed that our workshop especially concentrates on the 13th century BC in the Eastern Mediterranean, the time of one of the greatest crises in the Eastern Mediterranean. Then Eric Klein provocatively starts his 1177 book, The Year Civilization Collapsed, which is for a general audience. The economy of Greece is in shambles. Internal rebellions have engulfed Libya, Syria, and Egypt, with outsiders and foreign warriors fanning the flames. Turkey fears it will become involved, as does Israel. Jordan is crowded with refugees. Iran is bellicose and threatening, while Iraq is in turmoil. AD 2013. Yes, but there is also the situation in 1177. So while several causes for the late Bronze Age collapse have been suggested, an explanation which allows for the combined effects of societal overcomplexity, a few disruptive technologies, environmental pressure, and mass migrations, and with considerable space for regional trajectories, is probably closest to the truth. The last 4 years, we've consecutively discussed chronological issues, environmental problems, technology and societal collapse, as well as religion and cults in crisis, and especially textual evidence in Egypt and the Near East. And so most of these are published or will soon appear. Since the very beginning, however, of the discussions on the crisis years, population movements have received considerable attention. Nancy Sanders' 78 book, for example, The Sea Peoples, Warriors of the Ancient Mediterranean, set the scene for an unending interest in what, from iconographical evidence in Egypt, and despite the Egyptian tendency to exaggerate, seems really to have been a migration, since women and children are depicted, both on cards and on ships. Moreover, and again allowing Egyptian hyperbolism and aggrandizement, the death toll implies considerable numbers of people. The question for which we hope to find an answer is, of course, whether these famous or infamous sea people may be considered as a coalition of one-time refugees forced to leave their original homelands and in search of a new place to settle. We need to give attention to agency too, since people can have been forced to leave but without an imposed destination, or they can have been deported. Like in the Linear B records, for instance, of 13th century BC Pilus, we read of Cnidian, Miletian, Lemnian, Chian, and other women that are described as rawiyaya, captives, employed especially in the textile industry, often with their children, although sometimes they are also regarded as refugees. And Near Eastern sources abound in such examples. Prisoners of war taking, slave raiding, or forced exiles are common features of our text. But in the specific context of the 13th century BC, Near Eastern sources talk specifically about incoming groups, while several cities are destroyed by enemies. Hence, human agency, and especially forced displacement, remain to be discussed in detail for us to see clearer. And the reason, no doubt, that Eric is back here, and I thank him already for the willingness to guide our discussions. Within the brief of the present workshop, we stressed how we are especially interested in tracking the material correlates of conflict-induced mobility, their urgency, unplanned departure, short-term duration, and considerable risk. We hope that speakers will consider the variety of temporal and scalar categorizations that need to be taken into account. Temporal, since at least 3 broad episodes may be identified. The forced departure from the natal settlement, where archaeological evidence should be forthcoming, illustrative of sudden abandonment and conflict. To the passage itself, direct or with intervals, following either maritime or land routes, or both, again with potential repercussions on material culture, which could imply temporary shelters or intrusive elements. And thirdly, the arrival or settling at the final destination, prioritizing basic survival needs. Scalar too, since such movements can be individual, household-based, extended group-related, or massive. The larger the group, the bigger threat it forms. Moreover, the impact on the homeland, the frequency of movements, the prior existence of social networks, the nature and scale of transport facilities, the receptiveness of the host country are all elements that need to be taken into consideration and all have material correlates. Eventually, we hope to find out whether there is tangible material evidence for migration in general and conflict-induced migration in particular in the 13th century BC. And whether the concept of conflict-induced migration is at all relevant or useful to understand the collapse of Bronze Age societies in that century. Moreover, we also hope that archaeologies of the present can help us to understand earlier assumed cases of conflict-induced migration in general and the 13th century Mediterranean in particular. I may finally again thank all the speakers, my co-organizers Marco Cavalieri, Claude Opsamer and Jan Driessen, and especially the speakers who have journeyed from quite far, of course. Nicolas Kress, who is the man in the back, always filming, and the other members of our Aegis research group, as well as the members of the RRC World Crisis, our research group SEMA, the Institut Incal, and the FNRS for financial aid in the organization, as well as Nathalie Grossman and Michael Busch. Thank you very much.